can we draw a connection between the way that Inter made hard work, maybe, of that second tie against Bayern Munich, to the way that PSG and Barcelona, who up until Tuesday, particularly PSG, might have seemed somewhat imperious in the Champions League. They seem to have been doing everything right and looking like, proper contenders for the title. But Villa made it hard work for them, certainly. And Barcelona seem to have also struggled a little bit in their tie as well. Is there a connection that these, front runners made it hard work in the quarterfinals?
Yeah, I think there is a line to be drawn, Dotton, and it's a remarkable thing. Like JJ says, the fact that they are far from infallible, all of them. I mean, I think my famous last words at halftime at Villa Park, when me and JJ both were on Tuesday night, was, yeah, well, PSG may have conceded a goal, but this PSG don't panic. Yeah, Villa managed to get them in a panic, actually, in that second half. And it was interesting. I thought Luis Enrique's words afterwards, where I think there's a major difference between Inter, Barcelona, and PSG, which I want to briefly explain. I think Inter was sort of knocked out of kilter a bit by the fact that Bayern were performing at the absolute maximum of their capacities available to them. I think Barcelona, who we'll come back to in a minute, faced a much better Dortmund in the second leg than they did in the first leg. But PSG, I wanted to drill down, and I'm interested to what you think on this, JJ. How Luis Enrique talked about his young team getting a bit overconfident when they were 2-0 up. I mean, that 5-1 lead on aggregate should have been decisive, really. And at that point, when they were 2-0 up, PSG had played it perfectly, absolutely perfectly. I think Luis Enrique had picked the team perfectly. You could see from the way that the first goal was created, him making what a lot of people would have said is a big choice, because how good Doué was in the first leg, to pick Bradley Barcola instead. But that was immediately justified by the creation, I think, of that goal by Achraf Hakimi that he scored eventually. And when they're 2-0 up, you think, okay, well, they're fine, because not only are they the better team, not only are they 4 goals in front, but when they've got the ball, Villa can't get near them. And I think that was evident for a lot of the first leg as well. And we've seen Liverpool be in the same boat. When PSG are circulating the ball like they can, no one can get near them. And that Luis Enrique said it was overconfidence, I think, was quite interesting. You think of what a difficult start PSG had to their Champions League campaign. It's something JJ and I talked about on our immediate reaction to the match on OTC YouTube. The fact that it seems a million years ago at the start of the Champions League campaign, when they couldn't put the ball in the back of the net, they were flirting with elimination at the group stage for the first time in the QSI era. And that's in this same season. It's remarkable, really. But then again, you look over the season as a whole, and I guess if you're going to take on Luis Enrique's line about it being a young team and still learning, it makes sense, really, because I think that the highs have been so high, better than any other team in the Champions League this season. And yet the lows have been bad, and they were really, really close to getting eliminated on Tuesday night. There's no doubt about that. Despite the fact that I don't know about you, JJ, I felt that Villa really went for them, particularly for what 15, 20 minute spell in the second half. But for a lot of the rest of the time, PSG actually looked in control of it. It was weird. After that Donnarumma save from Asensio, you've got the last 20 minutes plus stoppage time that PSG actually see out fairly comfortably.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly, for 3 of the 4 halves, so 3/4 of the tie, PSG were, comfortably the better side, and it doesn't hurt me to say that about Villa. You have to recognise it, and Villa fans can be, really proud of the way that the team sort of handled themselves in that final half, the second half at Villa Park, and ultimately came out on top. I do think that sort of the fatigue and the adrenaline kind of caught up with Villa after getting that third goal, and they realised, just how much of the game was still left, and unfortunately they couldn't make the most of that kind of half an hour that was still remaining to get the final goal, despite going close on a number of occasions. But to your point, PSG were largely in control, over the vast majority of the two legs. But going back to your point about Luis Enrique, this being a young team, and sort of the complacency factor, there's, Luis Enrique has worked really, really hard since he arrived in Paris to get rid of the mental issues that have, dragged PSG down over the years in the Champions League. And that is a really underrated task in terms of, in terms of just how big and how vast it is, and how sort of deep rooted, some of those mental issues really are. With the exception of Marquinhos, all of these players are new and haven't experienced the kind of trauma of remontada, crashing out at home to Manchester United, numerous nightmares against Real Madrid as well. But the fans and people around the club obviously have immense experience of that. And something that I noticed at the end of the first leg in Paris was that loads of PSG fans assumed that the job was done after the 3-1 win at Parc des Princes. And, you can sort of see why. I do feel that ultimately that third goal in Paris was the killer in terms of knocking Villa out. But that complacency was something that Luis Enrique recognised ahead of the second leg. And despite the fact that PSG didn't have a game between coming up against Villa twice, and obviously Villa had to go to Southampton in the Premier League, he drilled it into his players that they had to be motivated. They had to show, appetite. And they showed that for the most part of the first half at Villa Park. But it was the celebrations of the second goal. It kind of felt like a bit of a decompression for the PSG players. And as soon as Villa sensed that they'd kind of switched off and they really thought that the job was done now, that's why I think that, there was such a strong reaction when Tielemans' shot was deflected in by Pacho, who, by the way, makes potentially a tie-saving block from Maatsen very late on in the game. I know Donnarumma was the hero overall for PSG, but it was a really important block from Pacho late on. But I think, that is maybe a warning sign for PSG. Yes, they earned their place in the semi-finals. There's no doubt about that. And this is a new look PSG. I think it would have been probably really unjust on PSG had they gone out, as much as I would have relished it in the moment on Tuesday. I think it really is to Luis Enrique's credit now that people have sat up and started to take notice of just how serious PSG have become. They are genuine sort of candidates for this Champions League now, and rightly so, but they are still a work in progress. And I think that's what's so fascinating about them, because they are already playing at such an impressive level. 2 consecutive semi-finals, one done without Kylian Mbappe and really any obvious talisman in the team, despite a number of massive, very massively talented players, but no sort of obvious star in it. And, Luis Enrique has really succeeded in moulding this PSG sort of in his image, getting them to play the way that he wants them to play. All they're lacking now is sort of that experience, which this will contribute towards, that collective experience, that ultimately will make them extremely formidable in these big kind of games where things get gritty, and they really need to sort of dig out the result. And the same can be said at Anfield as well. And I think Luis Enrique, as much as he is loath to change his tactical ideas, is having to become a little more pragmatic as well. I saw it more at Anfield than I did at Villa Park, but he is accepting that to offset maybe that slight lack of sort of seasoned experience in the team, he's having to change his tactical approach slightly and get a little bit more defensive every now and then. And, I think, PSG they're not the finished article yet, which kind of makes them such a frightening prospect for the future, but also a genuine threat, for this season's title.
I guess that's it. Collective experience, I think, is your key phrase there. You've hit the nail on the head. And you can kind of say the same thing about Barcelona. I think we're so used to seeing teams that are uber dominant in this world. So be it PSG or Bayern Munich domestically, Manchester City, that I think to see teams that aren't quite finished and maybe will never quite be finished. Who knows? I think that's something that's a little bit foreign to us in today's landscape of European football, which is quite interesting. Barcelona are definitely there as well. I mean, I think Barcelona have, well, either them or PSG have been the most exhilarating team to watch in this season's Champions League. I think PSG is so alluring because it's been so unexpected, really, after the start, that it's all come together really quickly. And when they're playing well, it feels as if they're better than anyone, really, in the Champions League. And, you know, you look at especially the first game against Villa, the 2 games against Liverpool, for example, when they blew Manchester City away, etc., etc. Even though it's quite a small sample size. But I feel like Barcelona have been clearly not infallible, but brilliant to watch all season. They've been absolutely fantastic. I think the way that they've sort of faced, when we talk about, you know, collective traumas of the past and club traumas of the past, the one for me is I was at the Montjuic where they beat Bayern in October, and the fact that Bayern always beat them, and they're the ultimate bogey team for Barcelona, and this team had none of that emotional baggage and thought, yeah, we'll take them to bits. Yeah, let's take them to bits. And they did it without batting an eyelid, without blinking. And that for me was the moment where you thought, okay, well, they've got none of the hang-ups of previous generations of Barcelona, and they're prepared to play like you feel a Barcelona side should play. Now, I think on the other hand, I feel less convinced by them after this win over Dortmund than I do with PSG, because I think you're right, JJ. Like that, what happened in the second half at Villa Park, and especially the way that Luis Enrique has framed it, feels like this is a growth experience. This is a lesson for you. We got through it. Just remember this. Whereas with Barcelona, I think the shocking thing about what happened in the second leg at Dortmund is it was sort of a reminder of, okay, if Dortmund had played like this in the first leg, we might have had an issue. And funnily enough, even though they absolutely hammered Dortmund flat in that first leg, Dortmund created a lot of chances. And I think you go back then after the second leg and you think Barcelona, if you look at the physical statistics, they didn't really do that much different. Now, I think you could say, okay, they definitely missed Inigo Martinez in defence, and he, despite not being a glamorous player, is an absolute key for them. I think him and Pedri are the key players for providing the stability of that team, and I think that made a big difference to the second leg. But if you look at the running numbers, Barcelona covered every bit as much of ground as in the second leg as they did in the first leg. So I guess, like, you could say there are some mistakes in there, of course, but they didn't really do that much different in terms of what they put into the game. Now, you could argue maybe they've hit a mini wall. They've scored once in Dortmund, once in Leganés at the weekend, both own goals. So all of a sudden, you've not got the free flow of Lamine Yamal, who was quite disappointing on the night, Rafinha, Lewandowski, who you're expecting to provide this flow of goals. But I think that the thing that would concern me is looking at that Dortmund game, and Dortmund had the chances actually to take it into extra time. I don't think this was like what happened at Villa Park. We talked about it at the time, didn't we, on OTC YouTube, JJ? The fact that it was very Champions League-y in that, you know, there are these flurries of momentum that take the game in one direction or take time one direction and the other. And we've seen this so many times in the last 10 years. So you talk about the remontada of Barcelona against PSG, the original remontada, the Romontada in Rome the following year. You think of Liverpool and Barcelona in the semi-finals in 2019. There were so many examples of that. Even Real Madrid against Manchester City at the Bernabeu, when it looked like Manchester City had it in the bag. You think of Real Madrid against PSG, the Donnarumma game. All of those. So really, PSG and Villa sort of fit into a tradition of that, I think, where you think a tie's going one way and all of a sudden something happens in 5 or 10 minutes and you're like, whoa, what happened there? That to me is the essence of the modern Champions League. But when you look at what happened to Barcelona, it's very different. I would be coming out of that game and thinking, God, it's way different when the other team turn up. And maybe we're not that good. Because to think that if Dortmund, despite being really bad in that first leg, and despite making tons of mistakes at both ends of the pitch, if they'd have taken one or two of those chances, then Barcelona are massively in trouble. And actually, they were massively in trouble anyway, against a Dortmund side who is, well, that clearly has something about it in this Champions League. So they reached the final last year, they reached the quarterfinals this year, but they're not a great Dortmund side by any stretch of the imagination. But they're one of those Champions League sides, as we've said before, that have got enough good individuals. If they can take advantage of the big moments, which they weren't able to in the first leg, then they can change things.